September 1st, 1943, Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. Inside a humid operations tent, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai flipped through an intelligence report and laughed. Not a soft chuckle, a laugh of absolute confidence, absolute superiority, absolute certainty of victory. "The Americans have built a fighter as heavy as a bomber," Sakai joked. "They call it the Hellcat. Another overweight American failure." Outside the tent, the proud Zero fighters glistened under the tropical sun. For 2 years, they had ruled the Pacific skies, an undefeated empire of blue paint and rising sun insignia. The Americans tried everything: P-40s, destroyed Hurricanes, destroyed Brewster Buffaloes, erased. And now this? A flying refrigerator called Hellcat? To Sakai, to every Japanese ace in that room, the war already felt won. What none of them knew is that this ugly failure would erase Japanese aviation from existence. And the most terrifying part? The Hellcat wasn't coming to fight. It was coming to erase. Within 30 days, the kill ratio would become so brutal it stopped pilots from sleeping. Within 6 months, the same men laughing in that tent would be writing their last letters home, knowing that meeting a Hellcat in the sky meant mathematically guaranteed death. The Zero wasn't just losing its throne. It was about to be exposed as a miracle built on fatal assumptions. Assumptions the Hellcat would crush. Japan didn't dominate the Pacific by accident. They dominated through cold mathematics. Pearl Harbor, 347 American aircraft destroyed, 29 Japanese aircraft lost. Philippines, Darwin, Malaya, East Indies. Every sky, every battlefield, every flag belonged to Japan. And at the center of that power stood the Mitsubishi A6M0, a fighter that felt less like a machine and more like a supernatural extension of the pilot. Ace Hiroyoshi Nishizawa wrote in his diary, "The Zero doesn't fly. It obeys thought." American fighters? Heavy, wasteful, built like trucks. The Zero wasn't armored. It didn't have self-sealing tanks. They even removed radios to save weight. Why? Because Japan believed dogfighting was an art, a duel, a proving ground for the spirit. And for 2 years, that belief was rewarded. Until an aircraft appeared that didn't care about honor, turning fights, samurai tactics, personal skill. The Hellcat wasn't coming to duel. It was coming to execute. And no one in Japan was prepared for a war where skill didn't matter. September 30th, 1943, Marcus Island. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui spotted 6 dark blue shapes climbing toward him. At first glance, he thought, B-25 bombers on the wrong heading? Then the silhouettes turned, revealing something new, unfamiliar, and wrong. Huge fuselage, shorter wings, thick armor, a monster of steel. Fukui smiled, the perfect victim for Zero tactics. He rolled into the classic diving turn, preparing to slip behind the heavy American aircraft and take its life. That maneuver had killed hundreds of Allied pilots, but this time, the sky broke its rules. The Hellcat didn't turn. It didn't run. It didn't panic. It went vertical, straight up into the heavens with brutal horsepower the Zero had never faced. The Zero tried to follow and died in the air. The Hellcat flipped into a hammerhead turn, a maneuver impossible for an aircraft that size, and came down on Fukui like a guillotine. 6 guns, not 4. The volume of fire was unimaginable. My Zero took 17 hits in 3 seconds. Fukui survived only by spinning his plane toward the ocean, but his wingman died. The recon aircraft died, and Japanese command wrote something in files that no one dared say out loud. If this new fighter becomes widespread, Japan will lose the war. October 5, 1943, Wake Island. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga led 12 elite Zero pilots to intercept yet another American raid. This time they held every advantage: altitude, position, surprise, experience. Shiga later wrote in his diary, "Victory was certain." But what happened next is the moment historians say Japan lost the air war, not on June 1944, but here. As the Zeros dove, the Hellcats below didn't panic. They didn't scatter. They didn't turn. They held formation. And when the Zeros opened fire, expecting instant kills, something terrifying happened. The bullets just absorbed into the Hellcats. Armor, bulletproof glass, self-sealing tanks. The Zero pilots emptied their guns, and the Hellcats waited until the moment the Japanese ran out of ammo. Then they attacked. Not by turning, not by dueling, by converting altitude into raw, murderous speed. They fell on us like birds of prey, Shiga wrote. Their mass, their weight, was their weapon. The Zero was a blade in a duel. The Hellcat was a wrecking ball in a cathedral. 8 Japanese fighters were destroyed. 0 Hellcats lost. Japanese command saw the after-action reports, and for the first time, they were afraid. November 11, 1943, Rabaul Air Base. Every surviving ace attended a closed-door tactical meeting. The room was silent as Lieutenant Commander Tateo Tanemizu, a veteran with 32 kills, began speaking. What he said destroyed the pride of the entire Japanese Naval Air Service. Forget everything you know. The Hellcat does not fight warriors. The Hellcat performs executions. He broke down what Japanese pilots were witnessing and dying from. Hellcats don't turn. They climb. Hellcats don't chase. They wait. Hellcats don't duel. They hunt in pairs. He pointed at the radios Japan had removed to save weight. We laughed at their radios. Now we die because they can coordinate and we cannot. The room of elite aces listened in silence as the conclusion hit. The Hellcat wasn't a fighter. It was an air combat system. For the first time, Japanese pilots realized skill would not save them. Experience would not save them. Courage would not save them. The age of individual warrior dogfighting was over. The age of machine-coordinated aerial extermination had begun. December 1943, Truk Lagoon. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the architect of Pearl Harbor, inspected returning Zero fighters after encounters with Hellcats. What he saw horrified him. Hellcat bullets had ripped through Zero wings, yet the pilots survived long enough to escape. But Zero bullets had hit Hellcats and done nothing. Then the reports got even worse. Pilots were being intercepted through clouds, in storms, at night, without ever being seen. Lieutenant Sadamu Komachi barely escaped a Hellcat ambush and submitted a report that spread through Japanese bases like a ghost story. They saw us. We did not see them. They knew our altitude. They knew our course. They knew our direction. We were blind men being hunted. Japan realized the true nightmare. They were no longer fighting pilots. They were fighting radar operators sitting safely on American ships. The Pacific was now a giant cage, and the Hellcats were waiting at every angle. January 1944, Kasumigara Naval Air Station. In 1941, a Japanese fighter pilot trained for 3 brutal years before seeing combat. 700 flight hours, thousands of rounds of practice gunnery, elite, methodical, deadly. By 1944, fuel was gone. Aircraft were gone. Instructors were dead. Training changed from 36 months, 6 months, 700 flight hours, 200, 100, 60. Then, finally, the darkest page in Japanese aviation history. 40 hours combat deployment. No night flight. No gunnery practice. No radio instruction. Even the instructors broke emotionally. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, training officer, wrote in his final report before being deployed, "Yesterday, Ensign Yamamoto arrived at the front. He had never fired his guns in flight. We had no ammunition for practice. He had never flown at night. We had no fuel. He lasted 7 minutes." What Japan called a fighter squadron had become a nightmare. Children in aircraft, told to fight professionals against a machine designed to erase them. This wasn't combat anymore. It was a generational sacrifice. And waiting in the sky, the Hellcat. October 12th to 16th, 1944, the Battle of Formosa. Japan threw everything into the sky, 700 aircraft, including the last fully trained pilots remaining on Earth. The radio broadcasts were euphoric. 26 American carriers sunk, 300 planes destroyed. The Americans are defeated. Japan cheered. Newspapers printed victory headlines. Officers toasted champagne. And then the pilots returned, and the gun camera footage was processed, and the nightmare was revealed. American losses, 89 aircraft. Japanese losses, 329 aircraft, and nearly every surviving veteran pilot. Lieutenant Sadaki Akamatsu, one of the handful of men who lived, wrote, "It wasn't war. It was extermination. As we climbed, they were above us. As we dove, they were below." They divided the sky into grids. There was no escape. You could feel death waiting in every direction. It was the first battle where surviving pilots didn't celebrate their survival. They sat in silence, not because they feared death, but because for the first time in their lives, they believed Japan could not win. June 19th, 1944. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese Navy launched 450 aircraft, its last major carrier strike formation. Across the horizon waited 956 American aircraft, almost half of them Hellcats. Radar operators detected the Japanese from 150 miles away. Hellcats launched, climbed, and formed a vertical curtain of steel. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading the Japanese escort, spotted them minutes before the slaughter. They were stacked from 20,000 to 30,000 feet, 60 Hellcats waiting for us, like a ceiling of death. In just 12 minutes, 42 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 0 Hellcats lost. By the end of the day, 346 Japanese carrier aircraft wiped out, 50 land-based aircraft destroyed. American losses, 30 total Hellcats. Did not fight Zeros that day. They executed them. American pilots coined the term that would haunt Japan for generations: turkey shoot, because the Zeros were as helpless as game birds. For the first time in naval history, a carrier air arm ceased to exist in a single afternoon. Autumn 1944, Japan. Pilots were no longer cheering, no longer shouting "Banzai" before takeoff. They were silent, because everyone understood a truth that no one dared speak. If you flew against Hellcats, you were already dead. It wasn't superstition. It was mathematics. Commanders tried to inspire them. Priests performed purification ceremonies. Women waved flags at airfields. But the pilots didn't look back anymore. They kept their eyes on the horizon because they couldn't bear to look at the people who believed they would return. One pilot, Lieutenant Shinji Hattori, wrote in a letter recovered after the war, "Mother, I do not fear dying. I fear that my death will mean nothing." No one had lost courage. They had lost hope. The Zero was still fast, still beautiful, still responsive. But every pilot now knew, when the Zero met the Hellcat, one of them always came home. And it was never the Zero. Japan's warriors were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to delay the inevitable. And every Hellcat in the sky felt like a clock ticking down. October 1944. New orders were issued. But behind the patriotic speeches was a truth Japan never meant the world to discover. The kamikaze was not born from fanaticism. It was born from math. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi ran the numbers. If a Zero attacked conventionally, chance of hitting a carrier? Near zero. Hellcats would destroy it first. If the Zero became a guided bomb, chance of hitting a carrier? 30%. Onishi said it coldly. The pilot dies either way. As a kamikaze, he at least dies with purpose. Japan sold it as honor, but the pilots knew the truth. The kamikaze wasn't a weapon. It was the admission that Japan could no longer fight. And the Hellcat became something it never wanted to be: a destroyer of human desperation, a defender against men who didn't want to die but had no choice. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, whose squadron shot down 23 aircraft during Okinawa, said after the war, "They weren't warriors anymore. They were boys in airplanes. We didn't feel victory. We felt sick." When Japan turned its pilots into weapons, it admitted defeat long before the surrender. September 1945, Atsugi Airfield. The war was over. The first American aircraft to land after the surrender were not bombers, not generals, not diplomats. They were Hellcats, the same aircraft Japan had laughed at. Japanese pilots, ground crew, and surviving officers lined the runway to see the monsters that had devoured their air force. American pilot Lieutenant Robert Bob Vall stepped out of his Hellcat and, through an interpreter, offered to demonstrate the aircraft's capabilities. In front of the best remaining pilots of the Imperial Navy, he performed loops, rolls, climbs, full-throttle acceleration with casual ease. When he landed, he told them, this was only about 80% power. In combat, with water injection, it becomes something else. No one applauded. No one saluted. No one spoke. Because every man standing on that runway understood they never had a chance. They had fought honor with industry, skill with machinery, courage with factories, and factories had decided the war. Saburo Sakai, the ace who laughed in 1943 when he first heard about the Hellcat, lived to see peace. In his final recorded interview before his death in 2000, he was asked, "What was the Hellcat to you?" He paused. His voice cracked, and he said words that belong in history. "The Zero made Japan powerful. The Hellcat showed Japan that we were not as powerful as we believed." He wiped his one remaining eye. "We thought we were samurai. The Hellcat showed us we were just men, fighting the future with yesterday's weapons." He added one final sentence that silenced the room. "Every Japanese pilot who survived the war survived because a Hellcat pilot decided to let him live. That is the greatest defeat." There was no hatred in his voice, only sorrow. Because the Hellcat did not destroy Japan's Air Force, it destroyed what Japan believed about itself. War is not decided by courage, not by heart, not by honor. War is decided by who can send their sons home alive. Japan built warriors. America built a system to protect them. The Hellcat did not win because it was pretty or elegant or heroic. It won because it brought its pilots home. Every rivet, every pound of armor, every gallon of fuel was the declaration of a nation that valued its soldiers' lives. The Zero created legends. The Hellcat created fathers who returned to their children. And that is why the Hellcat won.